So you could be talking to your friend down the road or in another neighborhood and they might not see any butterflies or certain birds, but you have tons of them. So that should tell you that we live in a place that there really aren't any one size fits all rules. And that's where having groups of people that can talk to each other makes such a big difference. And now, of course, we're all using social media for the most part. And the way I'm finding it is that it's pretty good. It's like nice and instant. And it's a lot faster than the library, but there are lots of things on there that could steer you wrong and get you confused, and you might not have the same results as the person down the road. Some people even quit gardening because of that. So learning where you are and how everything operates is more about observation than it really is about reading something and being able to stick to it, because it might not work and you're going to have to go through a lot of processes and experiment. So anybody have any questions about that? Right. Yeah. Now, how many people have a gardening situation where it's hard like that, where it's mostly concrete, or you have to garden in pots, or just certain things just don't grow for you? Could have to do with where you are, where the sun is, and all of those things. Today, I really think that focusing on how to grow for you would be a little bit easier than just giving you an overall scope of everything. But I think I'll start with the butterfly itself, since that's why you guys probably came to talk to me, or it's the snake guy. Who's here for snakes? Who's here for butterflies? Okay, great. So the monarch butterfly in our state is a little bit more unique than in other areas because we get monarchs to stay here year round because of our climate. It's not everywhere. Some people, your milkweed dies, your plants all die off, and then it's gloom and doom until the spring pops up and boom, everything's ready. But for most of the areas here in California, our planting season is really in the fall because we have mild winters and that's when all of our rain happens, and you really want your plants to establish good roots. So when the energy from the sun in the spring comes out, it's all poof, ready to go. How many of you plant something in the spring hoping to get some action and nothing really happens until the fall, and then you got to wait again for a whole other year? It's one of the common things here. Or your plant won't make it through the summer, right? That's probably the number one thing. And we all think that it's Home Depot. If it's from Home Depot, it's going to die. Who doesn't think that? It's because we're all being kind of geared up for spring at the same time as the East Coast, and their climate shift is completely different than ours. Um, Monarchs over there expand out into the wilderness and they end up in the far north. And then when the sun changes angle and the days stay cooler, they shorten up. That's what signals a change to the animal in order to produce this larger monarch that flies south as fast as it can, looking for somewhere to hang out. It's not looking to go sleep in the trees through the winter. It's actually looking to find a place that's more habitable, and it has a really long way to go. So they've adapted over time to have a bigger wing. They don't mate, and they really don't even stop to nectar too often. They just really get going and do their thing, and then they fall asleep as soon as they hit the wall. They hit that Central America, or it's like a big mountain range right down through the middle of Central America, and there's a lot of forests in there, and it's the last stop. There's nowhere to go from there except for the ocean. So they post up in these trees, and these trees create a nice warm pocket of air where they can sleep, and their bodies and everything like that, like they insulate each other. Have any of you slept in a tent in the cold with somebody, and without that other body there, it's pretty difficult, right? So that's what they go through. Um, Over here, as things have warmed up, they are also kind of coming out of that. So they used to come and cross over the mountains into California from the south and north and all ranges and post up in all of our forests, which got cleared in the 1800s. And what little forest that we grew for ourselves became home for them. Where they're trying to figure out how to fix all of that and make it so that the migration doesn't stop. But science is kind of showing that the migration is just changing because temperatures are changing and all of that. The earth goes through ups and downs. We're coming out of an ice age. How many of you didn't know that? right? It's pretty wild. Here in California, our biggest concerns really are two things. We have habitat loss, and then we have our urban fringe. And the biggest problem for humans in the urban fringe is managing our crops, our food, and wild animals and habitat and keeping it all kind of together, because we want to grow our own food and not have things eating it, but we also don't want to destroy the environment around us in the process. And it's kind of a balancing act. And right now, things are not looking so good for these pollinators because they're really sensitive to a lot of the new chemicals that we're starting to use in our environment. Um, in the European Union, they've banned some chemicals that we're using right now called neonicotinoids. And they're a nicotine based toxin that is used on all of our crops, especially in seed coatings and a lot of other things that are turning out to be persistent in the environment and actually building up. They're not going away, they're getting so small amounts don't matter. Small amounts over long periods of times being used constantly do. And they're finding it in places that we don't want it. And it has a pretty serious effect on the overall environment that way. Any of you guys remember DDT? Same thing. And we banned that pretty quick because it started causing problems in humans pretty quickly. This other chemical, and birds, right? The birds, biologists were really looking into birds heavily in the turn of the century, and that was a really big deal. Insects have kind of gotten the bad rap, and they're kind of last on the list, but it turns out that they're the first ones showing us that there's a problem because they're really sensitive to these things. Right on cue. So, if you want a garden for butterflies, you can't poison anything in your garden because you're going to kill them. And that's the bottom line. The hard part is that there's all these other bugs happening in your garden too, and you don't know what to do, or you think that they're killing your plants, or they're pests and they're getting in the house. There's all kinds of things. What you learned early on was we can plant milkweed and monarchs will come. I think most people know that now. What you don't know, what they don't tell you, is that all kinds of other bugs are going to come too, because milkweed isn't just for the butterflies. It is actually a keystone species, and no matter where you put it, all these other critters start to show up. And what's unique about that is that not only do they show up, but everything that wants to eat them starts to show up, and so on, until you end up with much larger animals starting to enter the scene that you're not used to seeing or haven't seen in a long time. This one plant can help. What else eats ladybugs? Because when I planted my milkweed, I got the thing from all the ladybugs. They eat all the aphids in the game. Oh yeah, well, birds and lizards and things like that also take advantage of them. The ladybugs, the butterflies, the aphids, um, everything that comes into your garden that hangs out. Red and black milkweed bugs. Who has milkweed? Hi. Milkweed collects all these little animals and they freak people out and they go, "What's that? What's that? What's that?" And then they start telling each other how to get rid of them. And then you start your struggle. You start trying to get all these pests off of there. And the next thing you know, there's so many of them, you don't even know what to do. It actually, right? Buying ladybugs. What happens when the ladybugs don't stay? That happens to a lot of people, right? Hi, guys. We'll start with the most basic one. The first thing you're probably going to see on your milkweed is going to be this little yellow bug called the oleander aphid. The oleander aphid is in itself also a keystone species. So that that bug feeds all kinds of pollinator adults that actually lay their eggs on the plant next to the monarch eggs or anywhere they want. And then those bugs hatch and they eat all the aphids and then they turn into your ladybugs, they turn into lacewings or hoverflies. You guys know what hoverflies are? Are you familiar with those little bugs that and they hang out and they look like a little bee or a wasp and you're scared of them? They're not, they're flies. And they're pollinators. All those tiny little microscopic flowers you might see around, out and about, those things need to be pollinated by something, and those flies do the job. Their babies are little spiky little maggots. I love saying that word. They suck the brains out of those aphids like crazy, right? And another bug, lacewings, are a long green fly with clear wings on them. Their little bugs look like little alligators. They're babies, and those guys actually can even keep the ants away so that they can eat the aphids and everything like that. So those guys also feed birds, lizards, and then of course those guys get eaten by predators like other mammals like small cats, snakes, and so on. They're probably looking for rodents. He might be waiting for you to come out and say hi. But the bugs are kind of going to be there. If you plant something to feed an animal, you should expect other animals. And that's the way it is. And the more you fight them, the worse it's actually going to get. Those aphids have a built-in reproductive system that goes into overdrive the minute their colony gets attacked. So you can like take your fingers and squish them or blast them off with water. What's going to happen is the remaining aphids, even the ones you don't see, are going to go into overdrive and just start pumping it out even faster. So they can take over a plant quite rapidly. Now, here's the thing: if you take care of your plant, they really don't kill them. I very rarely lost a plant, and it's usually from neglect, more so than the aphids being on it. But they creep most people out, and they get upset about it, and they go or they don't get used enough, and there's not enough animals eating the sugars they produce, and they end up with some black mold and stuff like that on the leaves. And what happens then is that the plant may start to wilt a little bit, and then the panic sets in. Especially if you think you have monarchs and you need food for them, then you're like, oh no, I need this plant really bad. I got to get rid of whatever's on it causing this problem so that I can keep the plant going. All for that one animal. Somebody will eat the ladybugs, they'll eat the monarchs, they'll eat the aphids. You got to spread out your smorgasbord. If you only plant one Jack in the Box and everybody wants Jack in the Box and there's no other restaurants, that's how it is. Yeah. Your milkweed will produce its own biosphere, so really you should be happy about stuff coming to eat those things. If you look at it the other way, you're going to be unhappy, and then you might not want to garden anymore. And that sounds like bunny rabbits. Bunny rabbits are hungry too. You know, if you don't have a surefire way of keeping these animals out of your garden for if you're going to garden for food, then really you should garden more if you can, because that really helps a lot. One of the things we find when we go out and we clear a new little spot and then plant a little garden in it is suddenly things like gophers and everything will move in and start eating everything. But what was there before you cleared it out? A whole bunch of weeds and other plants, and they were eating those things. So you took away their food and then put new food and then said, hey, don't touch that. And gophers are like 3-year-olds. You put a jar of cookies up there and don't feed them dinner, they're going to go for those cookies. Me too. Gophers are ubiquitous to California. In fact, let's go back. So we talked about climate zones. We don't know what USDA hardiness zone we are. You really have to know where you are located physically. You can't just your zip code doesn't count, your housing development doesn't count so much as, your weather and the climate around you. California is one of 5 Mediterranean climates on Earth because of this. It's actually a really unique climate zone, and we're a lot more like Chile than anybody else. And there's areas where it's dry, there's areas where it gets super hot, and areas where it stays cool and moist. We get more rain in the winter than other places, which is pretty unique. And there's so many animals that take advantage of it that we're actually the most biologically diverse county in the entire country. So when you put all of that together, you really realize is how can I live with the creatures, not how do I get rid of them? because they all live here and they all want to live here, and the only way you're going to stop them is a bubble. I don't know. Who wants to live in a bubble? No, we saw that movie with John Travolta, right? You guys don't know what I'm talking about. I don't want to live in a bubble. When I read science fiction books when I was a kid that talked about having to live in a bubble or some sort of a biosphere because we destroyed the planet, it really made me upset. And I don't think anybody would feel good about that. Like the dystopian future, right? Well, we're creating it anyways with all of our habits, the way we garden, the way we don't garden, not increasing habitat, landscaping practices in general. We've put in lawns, lantana, and a lot of plants that really don't serve that much. They may even have some flowers, but flowers aren't good enough. If it's just a pretty flower that's providing nectar, sure, something's getting some energy from it, but what about the babies of that thing that don't eat that? They really need some help. And then all the other creatures that support it actually create an area for us to live in as well, where we can garden easily. If you get rid of all the gophers, there is no aeration in the ground. We have floods. What happens when you have a flood? It washes all your topsoil away, which is where all the nutrients are. So you've got this problem that you're creating for yourself, and you're still fighting that gopher tooth and nail. Meanwhile, every day you sit back and you're like, man, I'm tired of that gopher, and you're like, where's all the bumblebees? Or how come I can't grow anything in my yard? It must be the gophers. It's us. And what we have to do is try to bring that back in. I'm 46 years old. When I was 12, 13, I really remember monarchs flying through en masse and around Christmas time, or usually around Thanksgiving, stuff like that. I remember bumblebees all the time everywhere. And now it's just not like that anymore.
Have you read the book? I bet you have The Language of Butterflies.
No.
It's an amazing book. Anybody here would have fun reading it because it's by a journalist who writes that I can understand. Butterflies.
I'm going to say something. There's a lot of wonderful books out there that have been written by people. And the further back in time that you go in these books, the more and more outdated some of the information can be. So as a gardener, I would say to take what you can from all of these little things and experiment and realize that your process isn't going to be about instant success. It's going to be about the experience of it. And once you start to kind of get in charge of your own expectations, then you can amplify your experience of it and have a better time. You might find out it's not for you. That's okay. But as long as you go into it with an open mind and you're creative about it and you're able to kind of take what you learn and maybe try to do something better, you'll have a good time with it. Most people enjoy it for life that way. It's all about your state of mind. Now, you could use pesticides and not have any bug problems ever, but your chances of actually supporting your environment are zero. You can have pretty flowers and nice green plants with nothing on them. And of course, it's very aesthetically pleasing, but then all the life is gone. It's almost kind of like, putting gold foil on a pack of toilet paper. It's the prettiest pack of toilet paper you ever seen, but it's not really good for anything except for one thing. Okay, maybe two. Blowing your nose. So, gardening for habitat is about the animals, not just the plants. And embracing them will help you have a better time. Now, that being said, and then knowing that there's all these climate zones, what's the most surefire, easiest way for you to have some success that's you can do right now when you go home? And that's just to make sure your plants stay alive. Don't forget to water them. If it's hot out, think, oh, it's hot out. I better check on that plant. That's how most of us end up in trouble, is just dealing with the weather and being too busy. Some of us are retired. Some of us have jobs. Some of us have 5 jobs. And we all have a different experience with that.
What about giving them vitamins?
You can do all kinds of stuff like that. If you notice your plants are coming back a little bit, not so green and happy, or they're stunted or small, there's probably time to feed them. You know, knowing your soil type is a big deal. Who gardens in the ground? A couple of you. So most of you container garden or have a raised bed or something like that, right? So we'll focus on that then. What kind of soil you put in gives what you get out. So let's say you go and you buy nursery soil and it's just peat moss and perlite, you're going to have to add something to that because there's really nothing going on in there. But if you just add regular dirt from the ground in it and you start watering it in, you notice that your ground gets really hard and compact and then your bed doesn't support anything. So you have to have a balance of aeration and nutrients and all of these things that you have to constantly maintain, because if you're gardening in a pot or raised bed, you're gardening in a closed little system. It's basically a laboratory. All kinds of things can happen in there outside of the environment around them, and you have to tend to it. So that's something to remember. It's a little bit easier to have in the concrete area if you have pots and things like that. If you had a plant for a couple of years, you might notice your soil has dropped and you have this much space in your pot, right? So it's time to renew. You can actually take that plant out completely, add more soil, and then replant it. And learning how to do it's as easy as a YouTube video and a garden hose with chips. Yeah. So there's that. Southern California is tricky, right, because of all these climate zones. You can see different spots in this very garden. There's areas where they have automatic irrigation, and then there's areas that are hand water only. And you can tell when somebody hasn't been able to come in and hand water all the time that the plants have a little bit of a different characteristic. So we live in a very hot, arid area in the summertime. And in order to maintain your plants through it, you want to make sure you have ample moisture and ample soil aeration, and that you just kind of otherwise leave them alone and don't chop them and don't cut them all the time and overtend, because those things have a lot of serious consequences in these times when these plants get stressed out. You're adding to it. No water, chopping them down, all of those things actually can cause issues. So unless you're trying to get rid of them, which some people are, you know. There's now nativity of a plant may be important depending on where you are. Some of you live really close to canyons with fringe zones and stuff like that, and you may notice certain bugs that you maybe don't see somewhere else in town. You should research what kind of plants that they eat, because then you could actually help support that little system. The closer you get to the center of the urban centers, you're going to see lots of plants that aren't native. Now, some of them don't really serve a lot of purpose, and some of them do. A lot of plants serve multi purposes. Milkweed is one of those plants. Milkweed all over the world can feed monarch butterfly. The reason for that is because monarchs actually have traveled lots and lots of times, not just for us moving them across the oceans, but they've actually flown across the oceans before on their own during whatever times and climate shifts and things like that. There's evidence that as many as 4,000 years ago, they've crossed into other areas and ended up on islands. But they're actually part of a much larger set of species of butterflies that eat milkweed. There's 300 butterflies known so far that eat milkweed exclusively, and the milkweed hasn't really adapted away from that. I don't know why, except for maybe it's all these other bugs that eat it too. Um, but you can get milkweed from Africa. That'll feed the exact same bugs here that a milkweed from California will, and also in the Midwest and other areas. The biggest issue you will have will be how that plant itself actually survives in the environment that it's in. And you can see that with native plants when you go out into the wild out there. They all have their different characteristics based on where they are. Now, if you only grow native plants in your house, but you have all these other animals eating these things and the native plant dies, what are you going to do? No, just leave it be. And that means it's doing its thing, and then those animals are going to be in a different area anyways. The reason for that is because these plants all grow in different climates. The animals themselves have their own climate instructions, so they may not even need milkweed at the time. There's lots of bugs. There's lots of uh, lizards and other kinds of rodents and stuff like that that need that ecosystem too. So you might be told, well, you shouldn't have milkweed in the fall, and you might chop it back. But in your area, you might actually be killing a whole bunch of other little critters that want to live on it, including predator bugs that want to eat those bugs that are on the aphids, and then they can regenerate. And then by the time it's springtime, those aphids could be gone. Like in the wintertime, there's a kind of wasp that attacks the aphids and turns them into a little mummy, pupates inside the aphid body, and then comes out as a wasp again. It's crazy, right? These wasps attack the aphids, their babies go into the aphid, turn it into a mummy, pupate inside, and then come out as an adult wasp, right? And it's, I call it a wasp factory, just like anything else. But like you might notice a whole bunch of aphids on your plants, and then one by one they turn into a little ball or something, like a little brown or a black ball. Those are actually those wasps in action. So if you go and take those aphids and squish them and peel them off your plant with your fingers, you're wiping out that wasp colony too. Now, those wasps pollinate certain kinds of plants around here, and they're really important. I mentioned climate zones. I mentioned monarchs over here. Go ahead. Right. That's exactly what we're talking about right now, entirely. Preserving the interface between us and the wild. It's more than just about native plants because we've been moving things around and we're trying to focus on these little pockets and trying to figure this out. But then when it comes to the actual implementation, it's difficult because they're trying to bring in native plants from all over the state to solve these little problems, but they don't all grow in the same areas. Now, humans have been moving plants around for since we've been around. So have all kinds of other animals. In fact, a lot of plants end up in other places, including islands, because of birds and stuff like that happening. Trying to preserve it is more about targeting the species that serve all of those as best as we can with what we have. We've changed the water table around our homes. We've changed how much uh, the nutrients can actually get into the soils that we have by doing that. And then the more we keep fighting these animals, we're not allowing this stuff to regenerate itself. And it's hard because we don't want gophers undermining our homes so that they collapse, like during an earthquake or anything like that. But then when rain does come and it takes away all the topsoil on us and we're kind of having trouble there, we can't totally artificially do what they can do because they can tunnel meters under the ground. Well, it's pretty incredible, right? And they provide food for a lot of things like birds of prey and stuff like that. Opportunistic species have learned to adapt to our environment and can definitely also cause a lot of damage as well, like crow colonies and things like that. It can take a population of things like lizards and rodents and stuff like that feed some of these other birds and wipe them out on their own for themselves because there's just not enough going on for all of that. So starting with a small garden, you want to try to feed as much as you can. That means overgrowing it a little bit. The squirrel probably needs something off of that plant that it's not getting somewhere else. And you could kill the squirrel and save your plants. But then what about squirrels nearby? They're slowly going away because we're making it less and less hospitable, right? Yeah, things like that tomcat bait that people use, it's actually pretty bad and it kills birds of prey too. So it's something we want to watch out for. Pesticides like foggers and garden sprays and things like that say it only targets certain things. It actually targets everything. You're just trying to kill those certain things. So they're tricking you into feeling okay about what you're doing by using language on these warning labels. And we're trusting the government to guard us against that, but they're following kind of the same line of thinking. If it doesn't hurt this right now, then it's okay. And unfortunately, those were brought over as escargot, and nobody's eating them. If you want to get rid of the snails, eat them. I don't know. Yes, it will. All the little bugs on that milkweed are food for a lot of different kinds of birds. You might see the little finches. I see a lot of or not hummingbirds picking the aphids off and stuff like that because they feed their babies these proteins. They don't all, drink just sugar. The sugar is actually energy for them to keep going, but they need protein too.
Your snails that you said are pretty. Are they skinny and kind of long? They have a tan shell with very different size of light brown, and they're about this high.
But so they're round. They're not the long skinny
They're
ones.
like this.
Yeah,
But
those
the
are the
ones
little
that are in the
cone
garden,
ones.
they're little round things, and I just pop them off like because I'm tired of them.
Well, they do. I don't know if they sell them, but I don't. Do you remember the name of that one snail, this long,
Well,
skinny shelled
can
one?
No.
you can put them in your compost bin, and when they go up to Oceanside, it becomes mulch.
They do have a snail, and
It's the,
they will
it's the snail show today.
they will invite
You
themselves
first,
over if there's
and
a
then you, sir.
snail that actually eats snails.
Milkweed in my garden. Two of them do well, caterpillars, and three don't.
Right.
Are there certain species of milkweed that do better in this environment?
In our environment, there's a couple of species, and there's only a couple of native ones that are doing good down here as things are changing. The narrowleaf is a really good one, and then another native species you can get would be a subulata, which is a skeleton milkweed. If you want to try other species from the United States that might do good, it really depends on where you are, whether you're north facing or south facing, and how much moisture that the garden gets. Some tropical species that do good here are actually kind of wane in the winter, and
What was the first one you mentioned?
a narrowleaf,
Does well.
yeah, the narrowleaf, which is the plant that's behind them, actually with the skinny leaves, and it's also growing out into the pathway. So
The milkweed in the wintertime, we don't where we planted them. They don't get much sun, but in the summer they do. Will the butterflies still come?
they should. They need to plant their eggs on the milkweed. And so they're going to come looking for it. You might see males first. You might see the boys hanging out, waiting for the girls to show up, and that's their job. They're actually the scouts. They find milkweed and post up and create a little territory that they defend.
Are there other butterflies that go on
Yes. There'll be butterflies. You might see moths and stuff like that. We'll have two species of butterfly specifically eating the plant, which would be the queen butterfly and the monarch butterfly. And then there's various moths that are opportunistic that can eat it too, like the salt marsh moths and little cloudless sulfurs. They like legumes. So one of my favorite plants to plant for those is like acacia plants because they have cool different leaf patterns and they do okay here. You'll see a lot of those, but there's a lot of native legumes you can plant for them too. One of the best places, if you want to plant specifically native plants for these pollinators, go to like calscape.org, and then they'll tell you based on your zip code the plants that are better for your area. So you might not be able to target a specific butterfly that you want to by using those plants, but yes. Calscape. That's one of the main ones I use. And you can also go on things like iNaturalist and look for certain species, and then it'll show you where they've been documented in your area with a little pin on a map. Sir,
Well, we all understand don't use pesticides.
that's number one.
Yeah. Now, what about the other pests, the parasites, the killers of OE, parasite, protozoa, acrid flies? Can you describe all that
Sure.
and what to do about it?
Yes, in fact, you know what? The protozoan, I'll do the tachinid flies first because the protozoan is the most controversial thing and it spans the gamut of issues that everybody's been buzzing about, including what kind of milkweed is okay. So the tachinid flies, there's lots of kinds of them. And this specific one that has been targeting them was introduced to help control pests in the agricultural industry. We're good at that. We're like, oh shoot, we let this loose. Let's try something else to fix it.
Biological.
Right. They don't necessarily wipe out the whole population, but what happens is for a small-time gardener is that the conditions are conducive, but you've got a couple of milkweed plants and all your butterflies are on it, then they all die because they're just right there. It's kind of like putting the buffet all in one spot. So if you can, the best thing you could do when you're trying to garden for habitat is spread it out and do as much as you can for all these little animals in order to make room. They are also seasonal, so they have about 3 peak seasons during the year. And if you watch, you'll monitor it. You'll notice that in times when there's less of them, you'll have more monarchs. But there's also other predators that can take advantage of them, mainly lizards and birds.
Tell everyone how the tachnid operates, how it kills
Sure. My favorite part, describing the death, right? So actually, it's not just tachinophiles. So there's certain kinds of wasps that can do this too, but they will lay an egg on or in the caterpillar, or lots of them. If they're especially if they find a nice big juicy one, then they'll just pound them on there, and then the baby hatches, goes into the caterpillar, and eats it till it dies. A lot of times, the monarch butterfly caterpillars and other species will start to pupate earlier because they feel full and they feel like they're ready, and then they'll go to do their thing, and the next thing you know, either out of the J hooked animal or the chrysalis, you'll see a little string going down to the ground, and that's because the maggot left, entered the ground, and pupated down there. If you have potted plants and you lose caterpillars to this, then there's a good chance that that fly is actually pupated in your potted plant. And if you have an enclosure that you use to try to keep monarchs safe, you could put that potted plant in there to feed the caterpillars, and then those flies could pupate, mate, and start laying eggs on them, all inside your protected environment. So that's something to keep in mind, especially if you cycle plants in and out a lot. That's something that people do. So it's like I said, it is seasonal. So watching for it can help you be preventative. And otherwise, there's really no way to stop it. So there's that. OE, I'm not going to pronounce the full name of it. It's a protozoan parasite that eats food out of the gut lining of the caterpillar. There's lots of types of these. They're all adapted to lots of different kinds of monarchs or butterflies and moths, not just monarchs. OE is talked about a lot because the focus is really heavy on monarchs, and the life cycle of it is very much different from any other protozoan. Humans get them too. And in particular, these kind are actually transmitted from animal to animal when they mate. So the monarchs mate, and then they'll pass the spores of this creature from one body to the next. And then when the female goes to lay an egg, a spore can be deposited with the egg. Caterpillar hatches, eats the spore hatches, suddenly it's got protozoans. They can eat several of these spores and produce a perfectly fine adult that has spores on it that can fly around, and that's how they spread. So in the mating season, especially in the summer, most of the monarchs have it, if not all of them. And it doesn't matter where they are, out in the wild or in the or in an urban habitat, they're just doing it. It gets deposited with the egg on whatever milkweed they happen to be laying their eggs on. So the key is in survival. Now, later in the season, the monarchs start to congregate in the warmer areas and they're mating and still doing their thing. And if they don't need to migrate, they live there all the time, they're going to continue to do that through the winter. A lot of people don't realize is that we all live in those areas because we want to be comfortable too. So in the winter, where it's the best to live, that's where we are. And some of us have milkweed, some of us don't. Some of us only have a few plants, and through the summer, they've had just revolving door of monarchs eating them, and you have no leaves left, perhaps. Or maybe you've cut your plants back for the season because you want them to go dormant and come back. Well, the monarch doesn't know where there's any other milkweed to find except for the area that it wants to live in. So they're going to lay their eggs on what they can. This is called egg bombing when they can only find one plant or a stem or something like that in their area. They're going to put all their eggs in one basket because they don't have a choice. They can't hold it. I've seen monarchs drop eggs as they're flying through the air because they're like, I need to put my eggs somewhere. It's a nonstop machine. Like so you might hear I should cut my milkweed back, or I shouldn't plant this one, or I shouldn't have that one, but there's monarchs laying eggs. It's contraindicatory, I hate that word, contraindicatory to take the milkweed away because where are they going to go? They're just going to die and all of those eggs with them. If you only have one little milkweed plant and you get 500 eggs on it, they're going to outcompete each other and probably not live. The OE parasite really becomes a moot issue at that point because then those monarchs don't make it through the winter and meet up with the ones that come from the migratory areas in the spring. So we end up with a slower population boom. It's a numbers game, right? The monarchs are different than us. Their babies are born knowing what they need to do. Our babies don't have a clue, but otherwise we wouldn't be moms and dads really. Um, but the more they can produce, the bigger their body of the organism gets, and then we get all those wonderful monarchs later in the winter that maybe roost in the trees. And here in California, we have dozens and dozens and dozens of sites like that that are just slowly going away between climate change and just removal. But the parasite itself that we're so concerned about in areas where there's either a lot of monarchs able to congregate and a lot of plants, or areas where there's monarchs trying to mate and there's very few plants, will present itself by what's called overload. When they're overloaded and there's too many in their body, they produce too many spores. The spores are transferred to the outside of the adult body during the pupation process. So when it goes into a chrysalis and turns into goo, the spores get forced on the outside, and then the body of the monarch forms with the spores attached to it. If there's too many, that means it's crowded in there and it's too much space, then that body of the monarch then becomes deformed, and then it's born deformed and unable to perform its monarchly duties. And that's where the hangup is for people is, oh no. And they just, especially for people that are raising them or trying to protect them from all the elements out there to get their survival to help with the population, it's a huge issue.
On that deformed body, if you see it coming out of the chrysalis, how do you handle it? Do spores fall or fly? Or do you have to
Well, the
dispose
spores
of
could fall, but they're really not going to live very long. And they may live longer on the plant during moist times or whatever, but really a caterpillar still has to eat them. So there's no stress there if there's no eggs being laid anywhere, especially on the soil. If they go in the soil, they're gone. They the spores are the reproductive cycle of these protozoans, and they don't want to die. They need that monarch to fly around and pass it on.
Are you supposed to cut back your milkweed, or do you just let it go?
That's the big question, right? There's so many reasons they say to do it, and one of them is the OE spore and preventing that from being laid in the first place. To your milkweed will grow back bigger. Your milkweed could get bushier when you chop it down. Depending on how you're gardening, it could actually get much prettier for you, but then the caterpillars are going to come and eat it anyways. If you watch a milkweed during the fall, if it doesn't completely die off and it stays green, the stem stays green, what it's doing is it's still doing photosynthesis. It doesn't need leaves for that. It's that whole stem is full of chlorophyll. Even the purple dried up stem looking stem on the tropical milkweeds is performing photosynthesis. And what it's doing is it's creating sugars, putting new roots out, and then it's going to use that to put out new shoots and new flowers and new everything right from the stems that are still there above the ground. Um, they're kind of like bamboo. It's a hollow plant with nodes, and then every node has the capability of producing more plant. And if you chop it all back, all that energy that's in that stem that is needed by the plant in order to put those roots down and then produce more is taken away, and then it's got to regenerate. And it can stunt your plant, or at the very least, it slows it down quite a bit. So chopping them back is kind of counterintuitive to what we're doing, because that whole thing of cutting plants back in order to get a fuller, prettier, bushier plant is more about aesthetic gardening than it is gardening for food. Milkweed that we find gets eaten by caterpillars regenerates way faster than milkweed that gets mowed. It's it operates off of enzymes, so it has a function and it's doing that function, and then when that function ceases, it needs to do a different function. How many of you know to cut the fruit off of a plant while it's forming in order for the plant to produce more leaves and stuff like that? Putting all this energy into flowers or fruit, and if you want more leaf, take those away. Doesn't happen immediately. It takes it a minute. It's like sends a signal down to the base, the control box of the plant that says, hey, we're going to do this instead of that, and it switches gears. So it's not that quick and easy. Preventing diseases is a short-term option because you're also preventing the monarchs from doing their thing. So I don't see a whole lot of benefit to chopping them back at all. Something else to keep in mind too is a lot of plants in the fall here around California that die, whether they're native or not, have a hollow stem or have litter on the ground. It supports a lot of other insects that need that stuff to pupate or even just to sleep in. I see bees, like there's a lot of solitary bees in the thousands of species that need something to sleep in because they don't have a hive. And we don't see them in our area because we clean everything up too much. We chop everything dead, we blow all the leaves out, and we more people are content with bare dirt than anything that, you know, as fascinating as that is.
You addressed this earlier, but I want to make sure I heard it right. So we've got a tropical milkweed there. We've got the narrowleaf milkweed that's kind of popping up all over the place. The western monarch, it doesn't care. Both are good for it.
Yeah, the food is fine. As a food plant, all the milkweeds that they are on, they eat. I've only seen about 2 species of milkweed here in California that grow here that they're not using. One of them they can use for sure. The other one I'm not so far. But we actually have 13 to 18 species here, depending on who you ask, that are native to this county. Some in the desert, some in the mountains, and some down here. And as you can see, as we get closer to the ocean, some of them do better and some of them don't. And the monarchs, however, don't seem to care. And I think the reason for that is because this whole place is their habitat. When from Canada all the way down to the south of Central America is their range. It's not this little pocket and that little pocket. What they do is they expand in the summer and then contract in the winter, just like blood in an organism. And everywhere they end up, they provide food for lots and lots of other life. Between them and the host plants, they're caterpillars. Sir, Oh, I saw all the heads pop up. In general, yes, between 30 and 45 days, the adults will survive. Once the female starts laying eggs, when she's done, she's done. The male is the same thing. When he's mated enough and given up all of his packages, he's done too.
Also, is it true that most butterflies get all their nutrition?
That's something that has been speculated about for a long time. I have seen it where they fly around and lay eggs and lay eggs and lay eggs and lay eggs and don't nectar. And so I was curious about that exact same question. And it turns out that they do get an ample amount of food as a caterpillar in order to perform their functions as an adult. The female and the male both use a lot of energy doing what they're doing, though. And what a lot of people don't realize is that the male, when he delivers a package to the female during mating, half of that package is part of his life force. It's just plain food that she digests during the process, and that helps her to keep going. So it's what they call the nuptial gift, right? I laugh too. And this gift can keep the female going. So you don't need necessarily nectar for a egg laying monarch mama. But the males, if there's lots of them, they can use a lot of energy battling each other. And you might see monarchs laying on the ground, kind of fluttering around, and that might actually be two boys trying to dominate each other, like it's a Greek wrestling fest. And and they are burning energy, so I will see them on flowers a lot more. So if you live in an area where you're seeing both kinds, the males and the females, you definitely want those nectar plants. But those nectar plants service all kinds of other pollinators too, including your hummingbirds and lots of different native ant species that don't hurt the caterpillars, but they need that nectar too. So it's good to have flowers.
That help explain how they can fly from Canada to
Right. So during the process of them becoming a much larger monarch, yeah, they have to rest, right? Yeah, I see them sleeping a lot. Sir,
Comments, I planted Mexican sunflowers, which is a little orange flower. Lots of monarchs and other pollinators landing on those. You can watch them. They unfold their big proboscis and they stick it deep down in there to suck up
they love
the
those
pollen.
plants.
Yeah.
You'll notice what plants do better and what do worse too. Like I'm looking back there, you guys see the hot lip sage, which has the white and pink flowers.
Yeah.
It's an okay nectar provider. I rarely ever see anything eating the plant itself. Um, but like there's other plants that are better at it.
Last year, I had a lot of adult butterflies come out of chrysalis last year. And on my plants, I've never seen it before. Actually, the first time. It's a queen caterpillar. Same coloration, same everything, except it has an extra set of antennae.
Right in the
Instead of
middle.
two sets, it has three sets.
Yeah, they have more of a reddish stripe too. They're pretty cool, actually. Yeah, we get them here when it's warm. They live year round out in the desert areas because we actually have evergreen milkweed in the state that lives year round out there. So it's actually pretty cool. Yeah, we have milkweed blooming in December out in the desert, but also in the summer, 120-degree heat, flowers, bugs all over it. Nothing else out there on any other plants when all the other flowers have dried out. It's pretty cool. All right, you asked questions about that. Does anybody here have a big question or a little question? Sometimes. If you have a potted plant, for sure you're going to want to fertilize them. If you have an extensive garden and you want to have more plant, fertilizing them can help. It's kind of like, you want to feed your kids or not and let them grow. They I like to give plants in the ground that in our area just a real basic fertilizer like a water soluble blended up at maybe half strength because you don't want to burn the roots, but they don't need a lot. They just need enough to produce what they're producing during the year. So I don't like to fertilize during the winter time when they're actually completely dormant or the height of summer either. Depends on the plant. Yeah, going into winter, watch the plant. If they're starting to produce more stuff, give them some food. If they're pulling back or they're dying back, that's called senescing, then they really just need to be given a break. They'll get everything they need out of the stems that are above the ground, and then once those are dead, then you can actually chop that off if you want to. But uh, anything that dies above the ground is being sucked down. So if it's still yellow and pliable, leave it alone for a little while. It's feeding itself. One more question. One more.
Have you brought some milkweed, you
I
said?
had,
Yes.
I needed to plant some shrubs and
I think this is.
we did some and they didn't like it. So, I was traveling around and I had realized that a lot of the landscape around here they're thorny. They, if you break them, they give out this latex white goo. Um, but they grow like crazy. And I found out they were from South Africa, where they have another Mediterranean climate. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any bird or beast that is interested in eating this plant. And so, a
That's
word
the
of
big
warning.
question, right? Some of these plants are purely ornamental over here. They might feed all kinds of things over there. And that's one of those big questions. That's why when people mention native plants, it really is relative to what's going on with the plants themselves, just as much as where it is.
So I thought I was doing a good thing.
Yeah.
Mediterranean.
You can't go wrong with native plants unless you plant a native plant where it doesn't normally grow. Because guess what? It was native somewhere, but that's there. All right. There's another person who probably wants to do some talking. I brought milkweed to sell for everybody. All the milkweed that we're selling today supports our nonprofit, which we do education and school programs, and we teach kids how to farm and provide school gardens. So that's what that's for. And I'll be here until you guys stop seeing me. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much.